Welcome back to Before the Day Ends. So we're in Matthew 8 and 9, which is really the second book of Matthew, the first half of the second book in particular. We're looking at Jesus' works and wonders. And one thing Matthew is doing here is he's comparing Jesus to Moses. In the Exodus story, Moses is called by God to free God's people, Israel, from the hands of Pharaoh, so they can be free to worship God without the threat of an oppressor. And to do that, we have these 10 plagues in Exodus, or works and wonders. So there's 3, 3, 3, plus 1, and that's the kind of the format of how they're laid out in the book of Exodus, as we see Moses setting God's people free. Well, with Jesus, he is also setting his people free, freedom from sin. And so the authority of Jesus, which we saw beginning in Matthew 5 through 7, as he gives his covenant, his Sermon on the Mount, if you will, is not going to be shown through his actions. And so in 8 and 9, the same format of 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 1 that we saw in Exodus is going to be shown here, as Jesus is seen as the one who is setting his people free, creating a new people for himself, leading his people as did Moses. So in the first 3, if you remember, they're all about breaking boundaries. So we had Jesus healing a centurion's servant who was a Gentile, Jesus touching a leper who was considered unclean, Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law who was a woman and therefore a second-class citizen. So we see Jesus breaking boundaries. At the end of that set of 3, we have a break that is about discipleship. And what we see in the discipleship section is this dichotomy between those who call Jesus Lord, those who follow him, those who accept his authority over their lives, and those who call him Rabbi. Those who say, he's a good teacher, but that's about all that's going to affect me. In the second set of 3 in Matthew, there's a change. The 3 are put together in terms of his authority over different things. So starts off with authority over nature. Jesus stills a storm. He has authority to tell a storm to be quiet, and it does. Then it goes a step beyond that to have authority over the supernature, or supernatural. So he casts out demons. And then, bigger than those two, bigger than a storm, bigger than casting out demons, he has authority to forgive sin. And that causes some problems with the religious leadership. So Jesus has authority over everything, including forgiving our sins. Then we have a section on discipleship again. And now we're moving into the third triad, if you will. And in this section, it's going to change a little bit. Jesus is still going to break boundaries. So he's going to heal a woman who has a blood disorder. He is going to raise the dead. And then he also cures 2 blind men. In a sense, this triad kind of reflects on the other 6, but it's heightened, it's bigger, right? Instead of healing someone who is sick of leprosy, now he's telling them to rise and walk out of a tomb, or someone who's been dead. And so this is kind of a big deal. Jesus has power over diseases, demons, and even death. But we're missing one, right? We had 3 plus 3. Now these new 3, what's the last one? The 10th. Because in the Exodus story, if you think about it, that was the big one. That's the one that set God's people free. It was the Passover. It was the death of the firstborn of Egypt. It was the pinnacle, the climax. So if Matthew is kind of following this model from the Exodus, what's he going to do here for the 10th year? We expect something kind of big. Well, we do in a sense. Let's take a look in Matthew chapter 9, and we'll begin here in verse 32, which is this 10th miracle. So, 9 verse 32. After they had gone away, a demoniac who was mute was brought to him. And when the demon had been cast out, the one who had been mute spoke. And the crowds were amazed and said, "Never has anything like this been seen in Israel." But the Pharisees said, "By the ruler of the demons he casts out demons." So, in a way, this doesn't seem like a huge deal, does it? He's done this. He's cured people, like in this case a mute person. He's cast out demons. He does that here. So, how is this a climax? Well, go back and look at the response of the people. I think that Matthew's highlighting this right here. the crowds are amazed, and they say, in verse 33, "Never has anything like this been seen in Israel." So that's their response, right? They're amazed. They're excited. I mean, this kind of authority to cast out demons and cure people and still storm, this has never been seen before. This kind of authority on earth has not been seen before. And they seem to be pretty excited about it, as they should be. But the response of the religious leaders, the Pharisees, is to say, well, it is by the ruler of demons he casts out demons. So his authority, the source of his authority, is not God, it's the demons. And so we discredit everything he did, all his miracles, because his authority comes from Satan. So why? Why do these two groups see things so differently? This happens to us all the time. It shouldn't be that surprising. Where we have two groups looking at the same evidence will draw radically different conclusions. And that's because all of us, you and me included, have lenses behind our eyeballs. Lenses that look at the world and tell a different story, perhaps, because our perceptions, our expectations, our background, stuff like that. Take archaeologists, for example. They'll do a dig and a tell, they'll go down and they'll excavate and they'll find things in pottery and bones and whatever they find, walls. And they begin to tell a story about what they found. I mean, yes, they're looking at evidence, but how did it get there? What's its story? What is it telling us? What conclusions can we draw from it? Well, a lot of those things are assumptions based on other material, whether written or tradition, whatever it is, that gets attached to that fact. And that's true of our media today as well. Conclusions are often based upon a point of view. Two groups, two people will look at this exact same evidence and draw conclusions that are wildly different based upon how they interpret those facts. What stories are they telling themselves behind their eyeballs when they see those facts that interpret the conclusions in different ways? Or what they'll do is they'll use their stories, their assumptions, their preconceptions to explain away the facts that they see or interpret them in a different way so as to discredit them or to change them or to bolster them. It's just how we see facts has an element of the information that exists behind our eyes, our assumptions, our preconceived notions, even what we want the conclusion to look like. We'll go out in search of facts to bolster what we want the conclusion to be. So here the religious leaders see Jesus as a threat to their power. They can't have that. So instead of saying that miracle never happened, it did. They saw it. It was there. The man who was blind can see. The mute can speak. The dead have been raised. They can see these things happen. But they discredit those facts by saying that Jesus does these things under the auspices of Satan himself, that he uses Satan's power to do these things. Instead of seeing God working, they make excuses for what they see. And again, these things happen to us as well. Now, by the way, this particular example of saying that Jesus is basically working for Satan is going to happen again in chapter 12 of Matthew, and I'll deal with that then. That's a very, very important passage in chapter 12, and it includes what we call the unforgivable sin, which is tied to this right here. So keep this in mind, and we'll deal with it again in chapter 12. So the big point, though, this crux of the 10th miracle is all about authority. How will you and I see Jesus' authority as having a claim on our life? Because a decision has to be made. If we see Jesus with the authority coming from God, then all he said before this in Matthew 5 through 7 matters to us. We are to follow him and do the things he has called us to do. Take a look, for example, in Matthew 9:35. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and curing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send laborers into his harvest." The first thing I want to point out is that there's what we call an inclusio. Inclusio is like bookends. Here, and then back in Matthew chapter 4. Right before the Sermon on the Mount, before we have the new covenant of Jesus, his new contract with us in Matthew 5 through 7, look what it says in Matthew 4, verse 23. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. Now, go back to Matthew 9, verse 35. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. So we see that this kind of bookends right around what begins the new covenant of Jesus in Matthew 5 through 7 and ending with the works and wonders like we saw with Moses in Matthew 8 and 9. What's going on? All of this is encapsulating this main point of the authority of Jesus, that he speaks, he teaches, he acts with authority from God himself, and then calls us to do the same based on that authority. He says, look, the people out there are harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And then he says, pray that the Lord sends out more harvesters, that's you and me, to go into the harvest to help do the work that Jesus is calling us to do, right? It says the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Well, Jesus is calling us to do the works and the wonders that he did, to forgive others when they sin against us, to proclaim the good news, to do all we can to take care of others, to help, to be available, and to be his disciples, that they can see what we do and believe the words that we say. When we teach as Jesus has taught us, when we proclaim the good news to them as it's being proclaimed to us. Now, that being said, will it be easy? No. It says the laborers are few. At the same time, are people going to believe us? No, not always anyway. Even if we demonstrate it with our lives, they're not always going to believe us. Not everyone will appreciate our message as they didn't appreciate Jesus' message. Not everyone will believe our motivations are pure. In fact, they may attach false motivations, false agendas, stories that they make up about you and me because of this message that we're proclaiming. But that's okay, because they did it to Jesus first. So we're in good company, and we're still called to go out into the harvest and do the works and spread the word that Jesus gave us to do. Have a great day. I hope to see you again before the day ends.